the spring of 2006, a small delegation of Russian aviation specialists landed at Shenyang Aircraft Corporation's sprawling facility in northeastern China. They had come to evaluate something that would fundamentally reshape the future of Sino-Russian defense cooperation. What they discovered in those Chinese hangars would trigger one of the most significant diplomatic ruptures in modern military aviation history. I am going to walk you through exactly what happened and why it matters so much today. This isn't just a story about aircraft. It's about trust, technological espionage, national pride, and the delicate balance of power in East Asia that continues to shape global military dynamics right now. Before we dive deep into this story, if you find this kind of military aviation analysis valuable, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us continue bringing you these detailed investigations into aviation history. To understand why Russian engineers ultimately refused to climb into the cockpit of China's J-11B fighter and fly it back to Moscow, we need to go back much further than 2006. We need to understand not just the aircraft itself, but the complex web of geopolitical necessity, technological ambition, and mutual suspicion that brought Russia and China together in the first place. I've analyzed dozens of defense cooperation agreements over the years, and few have been as consequential or as troubled as the Sino-Russian partnership that produced the J-11. The story begins not in 2006, but for decades earlier in the depths of the Cold War, when Soviet military planners realized they faced a critical problem. American fourth-generation fighters, particularly the F-15 Eagle and F-16 Fighting Falcon, represented a technological leap that threatened Soviet air superiority. The Soviet Air Force's existing fleet of MiG-21s, MiG-23s, and Su-15s were simply outclassed. Something revolutionary was needed. And in 1969, the Soviet government issued a requirement for a new air superiority fighter designated as the PFI, or Perspektivny Frontovoy Istributl, which translates to Advanced Frontline Fighter. The Sukhoi Design Bureau, led by the brilliant engineer Pavel Sukhoi, until his death in 1975, began work on what would become the T-10 prototype. The early development was extraordinarily difficult. The first T-10 prototype crashed in 1978 during testing, killing the pilot. The second and third prototypes revealed severe aerodynamic instabilities and control problems. Soviet test pilots reported that the aircraft was difficult to handle and prone to entering uncontrollable spins. This wasn't acceptable for an aircraft that was supposed to dogfight with American fighters. Mikhail Simonov, who had taken over leadership of the design bureau, made a crucial decision. Rather than incrementally improving the T-10, he authorized a complete redesign. The result was the T-10OS, which first flew in April 1981. This aircraft bore only superficial resemblance to the original T-10. The fuselage was completely redesigned with a distinctive blended wing body configuration. The wing area was increased by nearly 25%. The horizontal stabilizers were moved from the wings to the rear fuselage. Most importantly, the aerodynamic instabilities were eliminated through a combination of redesigned control surfaces and a revolutionary analog fly-by-wire flight control system. I've spent years studying Cold War aviation programs, and the Su-27 stands out as something truly special. Its development consumed enormous resources during the final years of the Soviet Union, with estimates suggesting the program cost between 12 and 15 billion rubles in 1980s currency. The design philosophy behind the flanker was radically different from anything the Soviets had built before. Instead of focusing purely on speed and altitude like the MiG-25 or MiG-31, or emphasizing simplicity and cost-effectiveness like the MiG-21, the Su-27 emphasized a balanced combination of maneuverability, range, weapons capacity, and radar performance. Let me walk you through what made this aircraft so revolutionary from a technical standpoint. The Su-27's airframe was extraordinarily large for a fighter aircraft, measuring nearly 22 meters in length with a wingspan of 14.7 meters. This size allowed for massive internal fuel capacity of over 9,000 kilograms, giving the aircraft a ferry range of approximately 3,600 kilometers. This was critical for Soviet defense strategy, which needed fighters capable of patrolling the enormous distances of Soviet airspace from the Arctic to the Pacific. the twin Saturn AL-31F afterburning turbofan. Engines, each producing over 12,000 kilograms of thrust, gave the Su-27 a thrust-to-weight ratio exceeding 1:1 in air combat configuration. This meant the aircraft could accelerate vertically, sustaining climbs at angles that would cause most Western fighters to stall. The engines were also positioned unusually far apart, separated by a large space that housed the main landing gear and allowed for weapons carriage. This wide engine separation improved the aircraft's resistance to catastrophic damage. A missile hit on one engine wouldn't necessarily destroy the other. The weapon system was equally impressive. The Su-27 could carry up to 6 R-7 beyond visual range missiles, along with 4 R-73 short-range infrared missiles, giving it a 10-missile loadout that matched or exceeded any Western fighter. The N001 coherent pulse Doppler radar could track 10 targets simultaneously and engage 2. The radar's maximum detection range against fighter-sized targets was about 90 kilometers, respectable, though not quite matching the F-15's APG-63 radar. What really set the Su-27 apart was its maneuverability. Soviet engineers had developed a concept they called supermaneuverability, the ability to maintain control. At angles of attack where Western fighters would stall, the Su-27 could perform the famous Pugachev's Cobra maneuver, pitching the nose up 90 degrees or more while maintaining a relatively level flight path, then recovering to level flight. While the tactical utility of such maneuvers was debated, they demonstrated unprecedented flight control authority and aerodynamic capability. The Su-27 entered service with Soviet Air Defense Forces in 1985 and immediately began establishing itself as a formidable combat aircraft. When Western intelligence agencies first observed Su-27s deployed to bases near the Soviet borders, there was genuine concern. NATO fighter pilots, who later trained against former Soviet Su-27s, universally expressed respect for the aircraft's capabilities, particularly its high alpha handling and weapons load. One American F-15 pilot I spoke with years ago described flying against the Su-27 as fighting an opponent who was both bigger and more agile than you expected, a combination that demanded respect. When the Soviet Union collapsed in December 1991, Russia inherited this technological masterpiece, but found itself in catastrophic financial condition. The economic crisis was profound, beyond what most Westerners understood at the time. Russian defense factories that had employed tens of thousands of workers were shutting down. Skilled engineers were leaving the aviation industry to drive taxis or sell goods in street markets because defense enterprises couldn't pay salaries for months at a time. The Russian Air Force, which had planned to receive hundreds of Su-27s throughout the 1990s, could barely afford fuel to keep existing aircraft flying, let alone purchase new production aircraft. I remember reading reports from Russian aviation factories during this period. It was heartbreaking. Factories that had produced some of the most sophisticated military aircraft in the world were literally running out of electricity because they couldn't pay their power bills. Test pilots were grounded not because of weather or maintenance issues, but because there was no money for aviation fuel. The Komsomol-Skonomor Aviation Production Association, known as KNAAPO, which manufactured the Su-27, had orders for only a handful of aircraft per year when they had the capacity to produce dozens. Meanwhile, across the border, China was watching Russia's crisis with a mixture of concern and opportunity. The relationship between China and the Soviet Union had been hostile for decades. The Sino-Soviet split of the 1960s had transformed former communists, allies into bitter rivals, with both nations maintaining massive military forces along their shared border. In 1969, Chinese and Soviet forces had actually fought in border clashes along the US's Surrey River, with casualties on both sides. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, China had regarded the Soviet Union as a potentially greater threat than the United States. But the collapse of the Soviet Union changed everything. Russia was no longer an ideological rival or an expansionist threat. Instead, it was a struggling post-Soviet state, desperately needing revenue and no longer in a position to threaten Chinese security. The Chinese leadership, particularly Deng Xiaoping and his successors, saw an extraordinary opportunity. For decades, China had struggled to develop modern military technology independently. Chinese attempts to design indigenous jet fighters had produced aircraft that were generations behind Western and Soviet designs. The People's Liberation Army Air Force in the early 1990s was equipped almost entirely with aircraft based on Soviet designs from the 1950s and 1960s, designs that China had either purchased or reverse-engineered decades earlier. The Shenyang J-6, based on the MiG-19, was a 1950 zero-day fighter that lacked radar and carried only primitive weapons. The Chengdu J-7, based on the MiG-21, was somewhat more capable, but still represented 1960s technology. These aircraft were hopelessly outclassed by modern Western fighters. More importantly, they were becoming obsolete compared to aircraft operated by Taiwan, which had begun receiving American F-16s, and Japan, which operated F-15 Eagles. The Chinese military leadership understood that if conflict erupted over Taiwan or in the South China Sea, the PLAAF would be slaughtered by modern American and Taiwanese fighters. This wasn't just a theoretical concern. The 1991 Gulf War had demonstrated what modern Western air power could accomplish against a military equipped with Soviet-era technology. Chinese military analysts watched Iraqi forces equipped with Soviet aircraft and air defense systems, similar to what China possessed, being systematically destroyed by American F-15s, F-16s, and F-A-18s. The message was clear. China needed modern fighters urgently. This created the perfect storm of opportunity that brought Russia and China together. In early 1992, Chinese and Russian negotiators began discussions about potential arms sales. The Chinese were interested in multiple systems, including tanks, naval vessels, and air defense systems. But the priority was advanced fighter aircraft. The Russians, desperate for hard currency, were willing to sell systems they would never have considered exporting during the Soviet era. In November 1992, after months of negotiations, Russia and China signed their first agreement for direct purchase of Su-27 SK fighters. The initial contract covered 24 aircraft at a reported cost of approximately $1 billion, making it one of the largest Russian arms sales of the post-Soviet era. The Su-27 SK was an export variant with slightly downgraded systems compared to aircraft operated by the Russian Air Force. The radar capabilities were reduced. Certain electronic warfare systems were omitted or simplified, and the weapons package was more limited. Nevertheless, it represented a quantum leap for the Chinese Air Force. I want you to understand what this meant for Chinese pilots who transitioned from J-7 South to Su-27 SKs. The J-27 had a maximum speed of Mach 1.8 at altitude but couldn't supercruise. Its radar, if the later variants even had radar, could barely detect targets beyond 30 kilometers. Weapon load was limited to maybe 2,000 kilograms across 5 hardpoints. Combat radius was perhaps 700 kilometers with external fuel tanks. The Su-27 SK, in comparison, could reach Mach 2.35. Its radar could detect and track targets beyond 80 kilometers. It could carry up to 6,000 kilograms of weapons across 12 hardpoints. Combat radius exceeded 1,500 kilometers with internal fuel alone. The difference wasn't incremental, it was revolutionary. Chinese pilots trained on the Su-27 SK described it as like upgrading from driving an old truck to piloting a sophisticated racing car with advanced electronics. The first batch of Su-27 SKs arrived in China in 1992, and Chinese pilots began intensive training with Russian instructors. The learning curve was steep. The Su-27's fly-by-wire system, high-angle of-attack handling, and complex weapon systems required entirely new training approaches. But Chinese pilots proved adaptable and enthusiastic. By 1996, the PLAAF had fully integrated these aircraft into operational units, and their combat capabilities had been transformed. But China's ambitions extended far beyond simply purchasing Russian aircraft off the production line. The Chinese defense industry had developed a consistent long-term strategy over decades: acquire foreign technology, study it intensively, reverse engineer key components, modify designs for Chinese requirements. and eventually produce indigenous versions that eliminated dependence on foreign suppliers. This approach had worked with earlier Soviet designs like the MiG-19 and MiG-21, which China had transformed into the J-6 and J-7 families. Chinese strategists saw no reason the same approach wouldn't work with the Su-27, though the technological complexity would be far greater. In 1995, after the successful integration of the first batch of Su-27 SKs, Chinese officials approached Russia with a more ambitious proposal. Instead of continuing to purchase completed aircraft from Russian production lines, China wanted to license the complete technology package and establish domestic production. This would include not just assembly of Russian-supplied components, but gradually increasing indigenization of parts and systems, until China could produce the aircraft entirely from domestic sources. The negotiations that followed were complex and sometimes contentious. Russian officials understood perfectly well what China intended. They had seen China reverse engineer previous Soviet designs. They knew that licensing Su-27 production would eventually lead to Chinese competition in export markets. However, the financial pressures were overwhelming. Russia needed the revenue that a major licensing deal would generate. The Russian defense industry needed work to keep factories and design bureaus functioning. And there was a geopolitical calculation as well. Closer defense ties with China could balance against NATO expansion and American power in Asia. In December 1996, after more than a year of negotiations, Russia and China signed a licensing agreement that would shape both nations' aviation industries for decades. The contract authorized Shenyang Aircraft Corporation to assemble 200 Su-27 SK aircraft under license. These Chinese-assembled aircraft would be designated J-11A. The agreement was reported to be worth approximately $2.5 billion, making it one of the largest defense technology transfers of the post-Cold War era. The contract's specific terms were never fully published, but based on multiple sources and interviews with people familiar with the negotiations, I can outline the general framework. Russia would supply major assemblies, including airframes, engines, avionics packages, and weapon systems for the full 200 aircraft run. Russian engineers would provide technical documentation, training for Chinese production workers, and assistance in establishing production facilities. China would be responsible for final assembly, testing, and delivery to the PLAAF. Payment would be structured over the life of the program, with initial payments for technology transfer, followed by aircraft payments as planes were completed. Critically, the agreement explicitly stated that all 200 aircraft would be built using Russian-supplied components, with limited Chinese content allowed only for non-critical items like wiring harnesses and some structural components. The contract also specified that China would not modify the basic design without Russian approval and would not export the aircraft or use the technology to develop competing designs. These provisions were absolutely clear, though their enforcement mechanisms were vague. There was no provision for independent auditing of Chinese production, no automatic penalties for violations, no arbitration process other than bilateral discussions. The production program began with considerable optimism. On both sides, Shenyang Aircraft Corporation invested heavily in new facilities, including expanded production halls, modern tooling, and testing equipment. Russian specialists arrived to train Chinese workers on assembly procedures, quality control standards, and testing protocols. The first J-11A aircraft, assembled primarily from Russian components, rolled out in 1998. It performed well in testing, and deliveries to PLAAF units began later that year. For the first few years, the program appeared to be functioning as intended. Shenyang completed and delivered J-11 at a steady pace, ordering components from Russian suppliers according to the agreed schedule. Chinese pilots were pleased with the aircraft's performance, which was essentially identical to the Su-27 SK. Russian factories received regular orders and payments, providing crucial revenue during Russia's continued economic difficulties in the late 1990s. However, by 2000 or 2001, patterns began emerging that concerned Russian defense industry officials. The pace of component orders from China was slowing. Shenyang had assembled approximately 95 J-11A aircraft by 2003. meaning they should have been ordering components for the next 100 aircraft to maintain production continuity. Instead, component orders dropped significantly. Russian suppliers, who had expected steady work through 2010 or beyond, found their Chinese orders dwindling. What happened next depends heavily on which side of the border you ask, but the objective evidence paints a fairly clear picture. According to Russian intelligence assessments and defense industry sources, China began systematically violating the licensing agreement almost as soon as they had accumulated sufficient technical knowledge. Instead of ordering components for all 200 aircraft as contracted, Chinese purchases slowed dramatically after only 95 aircraft had been assembled. By 2004, it became unmistakably clear that Shenyang Aircraft Corporation had stopped ordering Russian components entirely, yet production at the facility hadn't stopped. Russian intelligence agencies reported something far more concerning than simple contract violation. China hadn't just stopped production. They had created an entire parallel program to reverse engineer nearly every major component of the Su-27 SK. Satellite imagery analyzed by Russian military intelligence showed significant expansion of facilities at Shenyang and at several subcontractor sites throughout northeastern China. New buildings that appeared to be specialized for composite material production. Engine testing and avionics manufacturing were identified. Electronic intelligence gathering detected test flights of Su-27 derivatives with system characteristics that didn't match any Russian-supplied equipment. The reverse engineering effort that China undertook was extraordinarily ambitious, perhaps the most comprehensive such program attempted since the Soviet Union's reverse engineering of the Boeing B-29 bomber in the 1940s. To understand the magnitude of this achievement, you have to appreciate the complexity of a modern fighter aircraft. The Su-27 wasn't a simple machine that could be taken apart and copied with basic machine tools. It represented the accumulated knowledge of decades of Soviet aerospace research, incorporating thousands of specialized components, advanced materials, complex manufacturing processes, and integrated systems that all had to work together perfectly. Consider the AL-31F turbofan engine. This power plant represented one of the Soviet Union's most significant aerospace achievements, a complex machine with thousands of precision parts operating under extreme conditions. The high-pressure turbine blades, for example, had to withstand temperatures exceeding 400 degrees Celsius while rotating at enormous speeds. They were manufactured from specialized nickel-based superalloys using sophisticated casting processes, then coated with thermal barrier coatings that involve proprietary formulations and application techniques.